Alright, as you've read from the title of the video, it is mentioned to be an update to Sigewinne guide. However, it's not entirely the usual guide that we'll be watching. It's more of a guide where we try to make Sigewinne work to the best of her ability that she can, which of course is not in a way that tries to make her look better than she does, because while at the end of the day, she kind of still sucks no matter how you look at it into the meta. But of course, there's always an audience for every character, and hopefully this guide will help you guys out tremendously. Mizuki is basically here and Furina is coming back soon, so if you're planning to swipe for pooling, then don't forget to check out Loot Bar. If you know me, I've been recommending you guys Loot Bar before, since you can always save almost a 20% on all of your top-ups. With over 100,000 orders and so many good reviews at this point, you can be sure that Loot Bar is trustworthy. Here you can see my order receipts of all of my top-ups that I have done. So guys, be sure to check out Loot Bar through the link in my description, as it can be a great way for you to save your money, especially if you are topping up a large amount. Alright, there's already a million guides out there that actually explain how Sigewinne Kit actually works, so we're not actually going to be diving in depth into her kit in this video. However, to simplify how Sigewinne Kit actually works, right, her E basically kills your entire party except for her each time it bounces, which is like 3 Hydro applications per E cast. Now, to be frank, this is the lowest off-field Hydro application in the entire game beside Hydro Traveler. There's not much of an upside here besides her not stealing vapes from Furina in forward vape comms. Her burst may look like it applies a lot of Hydro considering that it hits very quickly, but in reality it has a 1.9 second internal cooldown. This means that despite the high hit count, it can only apply Hydro 2 times. She can't enable any Hydro reaction focused teams like Vaporize, EC, Happy Blooms and so on her own, and her ability to supplement Furina's application is fairly lackluster, which means that her Hydro application is pretty much irrelevant. While on the bright side, she is super easy to build, just, stacking HP. No need to worry much about energy regen since her burst rarely sees you outside of Nilu Blooms or EC teams. So, well, there you go. You may ask why her Hydro application is rather bad, and those are some of the main reasons. So we've just discussed a bit about Sigewinne burst. However, some of you has been asking whether or not Sigewinne burst is worth it to use whenever she is in her team. While the general answer is no, since it doesn't provide any support value and your on-fielder is going to be doing more damage than her 99% of the time already. This is especially true since she is tend to be built on a triple HP artifact sets to max her healing when you're using the Clam artifact sets for her Clam damage and her Ascension passive that buffs Furina. You use it only if you have absolutely nothing else that you can do instead, where I wouldn't technically recommend leveling her burst talent past level 6 considering how it is practically never used. Now, if you don't have Furina, then Sigewinne is pretty bad. Look, this is a big thing where Sigewinne without Furina is like a burger without patty. And then, which is technically still food, but why would you do that to yourself, right? Furina gives her a reason to exist. Without her, you're just wasting DPS and a team slot. If you really like Sigewinne, sure, but don't expect crazy performance from her. Meanwhile, another healer plus Hydro character like Kokomi is at least a solid on-field Hydro applicator for your teams like during Bloom, EC or Freeze. Sigewinne Hydro applications, well, as we've discussed, there's nothing that we can see to it. Before we go any further with Sigewinne, here's a bit of a comparison between Sigewinne and other Hydro character. For Sigewinne is quite different from other Hydro support character because primarily of how she is used for healing and Hydro application functions. First off, for Kokomi and Sigewinne, Kokomi provides consistent high AoE healings and strong off-field Hydro application via her Jellyfish, and she's excellent in enabling Hydro-related reactions and as an on-field Hydro driver as well. But Kokomi Jellyfish has no internal cooldown and it hits once every 2 seconds, while Sigewinne heals based based on Bond of Life, and the other Bond of Life user don't benefit much from her, which scales with party interaction rather than raw healing output. Her Hydro application is more limited because her bouncing bubble skill doesn't apply Hydro as consistently as Kokomi Jellyfish, since it only applies to every other hit. Xingqiu versus Sigewinne, where Xingqiu is one of the best Hydro enabler due to his rain sword, which apply Hydro frequently even when he's off field. Also provides some resistance to interruption as well from his kit, which is really nice. Where Sigewinne has limited off-field Hydro application and her kit is more focused on healing. Her Hydro bubble skill can apply Hydro, but it's not as reliable for reaction-based team. And if you have her as C2, her shield offers resistance only for her, and unlike Xingqiu who provides it for the entire team. If we're looking at Sigewinne versus Yelan, well, yeah, Yelan works very similar to Xingqiu but deals more damage output buff for your teammates. And she also provides strong off-field Hydro application, though she doesn't heal. Where Sigewinne is, unlike Yelan, Sigewinne lacks significant damage buff and instead leans heavily into her role as a healer. Hydro application is also much weaker comparatively, which makes her unfit for, as a reaction enabler on her own. And while Furina versus Sigewinne, we already know how good as a character for being the best offensive support in the entire game, converting healing into damage buff. Her Hydro application is pretty nice, but designed to work best in teams that deals a lot of healing. And as I've mentioned before, Sigewinne does synergizes a bit with Furina by providing Bond of Life healing, which count as healing for Furina buffs. However, Furina enables offensive playstyle while Sigewinne leans more toward healing and sustain. So that's a bit of a comparison to what Sigewinne and other Hydro support character. Now we move on to the more special sections of Sigewinne, and I'd say the most important part of her as well, which is going to be her team composition and rotation. Now this is where we actually touch on, and I've already chosen some of the best teams out there for Sigewinne to actually work in. Most of the other teams that you try to slot Sigewinne in that I don't mention in this video is more or less just going to be a little bit copium for her to be using. Even still, during these kind of teams, there are so much better teams out there that you can play, but as I've mentioned before, this is surrounded to be a Sigewinne guide and we're trying to make the best out for her here. Right, so as I did mention, Sigewinne do need to have Furina, and most of the teams that we're going to be discussing will have Furina whenever you are using Sigewinne. First off, we're going to be having a team such as Neuvillette, Furina, Sigewinne, and Xilonen. Sigewinne's role in this team is redundant due to Xilonen and Neuvillette being able to stack Furina on their own, and since this team is a triple Hydro core, you only get one stack of Neuvillette's passive. It's still going to be one of Sigewinne's best performing teams, but he doesn't bring much to the table here. Ultimately, it is kind of cold team for Neuvillette and Sigewinne Lore's Enjoyer, but it'll get you through most of the content without any trouble. For the rotation, is pretty rather simple. You start off with Furina's E to casting her burst, then Xilonen's E to normals and casting her elemental burst, to Sigewinne E, and then to, Neuvillette's combo rotations. Another teams that is going to be a Nilou Bloom Sigewinne teams where you have Nilou, Nahida, Furina, and Sigewinne. This may seem a bit questionable at cursory glance, but it's genuinely one of the most comfortable Nilou Bloom teams in the game. Generally, it is rather difficult to get full value out of Nilou Bloom team due to the aura states and your character's HP being difficult to manage at times. Using Kokomi as an example, if you on-field her for too long, you can overtake Nahida's central application and will end up just attacking a Hydro aura, which means no blue. If you on-field Nahida for too long, you can end up dying even to a fairly weak attack. It's a delicate balance you have to strike, and if you're not interested in optimizing for that, Sigewinne Furina can definitely be more up your alley. Sigewinne's role as a strong off-field healer and Furina fully ultimates off-field Hydro applications allow you to focus on just on-fielding Nahida. This won't be the absolute strongest Nilou Bloom team, but I can comfortably say that it is the most comfortable. The main caveat are that this team is expensive in terms of pooling, since it is a full 5-star team. There really isn't room for substitution, and the Abyss has been shifting toward boss-oriented content, which can make Nilou unfavorable. All in all, still a strong, comfortable AoE teams for the Abyss like the current one. Other than that, we have a mono Hydro team where you can run like a Furina, Sigewinne, Yelan, and then the last slot can be a flexible between Xingqiu, Kazuya, and Xilonen. Fairly straightforward team that uses Yelan as an on-field driver, since since no one else can be a better option. Kokomi and using both Shilone and Kazuha tend to outshine her pretty noticeably. Not a very strong team that I would recommend unless you have a vertical investment on Furina or Yelan's or facing single target only content. For the rotation, for example, if you're using on a Kazuha as a support flex options, you first off have Furina EQ to Kazuha's Q, then to Sigewinne E, then setting up Yelan's EQ, swap back to Kazuha's using his E, then Yelan's auto spam on field for a bit, afterwards switch back to Sigewinne using her E, Kazuha's E again, then Yelan auto spam, then you rotate the rotation again. Another team we have is an EC team where you run like Furina, Sigewinne, Auroron, and Kazuha. A pretty good taser team with flexible rotations. I would heavily recommend using Sack Bow on her so that her cooldown can line up with Fischl's better. If you're using Fischl's in Auroron's place, this would be my general recommendation if you don't want to invest too many pool into Sigewinne teams, since this is the least expensive team. This team rotation, if you're having Fischl in Auroron's place, and you can have like Furina EQ to Kazuha's EQ, to Fischl's E to Sigewinne E, swap back to Kazuha's E, then Sigewinne EQ, Fischl setting up her elemental burst, then Furina doing a bit of auto on field. Another team options we can have is a Furina, Kazuha, Bennett, and a Sigewinne team. Now Furina forward wave team that has been somewhat popularized for a while, but it's fairly suboptimal for several reasons. Kazuha's resistance shred runs out fairly quickly and it's pretty much impossible to re-establish a Hydro Aura for him to swirl off of until the end of the rotation. Bennett does not deal much of a damage on field, especially when he isn't the one vaping. I would not recommend this team unless the goal is damage per screenshot. For this team rotation, you can start off with Furina's EQ to Sigewinne E to Bennett's EQ to Kazuha's EQ, then having Bennett E spam. Another interesting teams that I want to mention is going to be a Furina, Bennett, Sigewinne, and the last slot is either going to be a Klee or an Alekino, which is another Furina forward wave team with fairly good synergy. Using Sigewinne over Kazuha Shilonen allow Klees to have notably better Bennett buff uptime and make the team more forgiving since Klee is a rather squishy character. Sigewinne's buff in forward wave are also more potent, which results in this team not faring much worse than the Klee's current BIS team, which is Klee, Furina, Shilonen, and Bennett. Worth considering if you want to save your Kazuha Shilonen for the other side of the abyss. Alekino is another option for this team, though her performance is very similar to Klee's, but she has much stronger teams available. We'll only recommend this if your other side is already covered and you really want to play Sigewinne. Moving on to a bit of a weapon discussion, her signature weapon is one of the best HP weapon out there in the game and provide the greatest stats of any weapons. But ironically, that does pretty much nothing for support Sigewinnes. It's only very useful if you play a DPS Sigewinne, which without vertical investment it is fairly weak. I would not recommend pulling her Sig unless you're willing to at least pull for a Sigewinne C2, since that is the earliest you should be considering for a Sigewinne carry team. For support Sigewinne, Favonius Bow is your best options. Stack Bow is really good in EC teams because it helps Sigewinne better align with official cooldown. Elegy is also a decent option, but her bubble needs to bounce at least 4 times to make it work. This can happen after your damage dealers such as Fischl have already snapshot their stats, which can make Elegy pretty much useless. Not to mention that the bubble targeting can be inconsistent against certain enemies. I would only recommend Elegy for forward wave teams with a Pyro on fielder, since that's when the buff timing aligns the best. For artifacts, Song of the Days Pass and Ocean Hued Clams are pretty much her BIS artifacts options for support Sigewinne, though Song of the Days Pass will perform worse than Clam if you're playing a team without a dedicated on-fielder. If neither are an option, you can use like Tenacity if you're playing with attacking scaling character. If none of the aforementioned sets are available, you can just put her on a 2-piece HP and healing bonus. For artifact stats, as I've mentioned before, you can pretty much just go ahead and have a HP build unless you are playing her on field, in which case you will need to build her on emblem set with around 200% energy recharge while building as much crit and HP as you can. For talent priorities, prioritizing leveling up her skills, though her healing is more than sufficient at around level 6 to level 8. Leveling up her burst isn't as useful since it's mostly not used. As I have mentioned before, it has a cooldown of 18 seconds but the durations of 2.5 seconds at a C0 and only a 5.5 second at a C4. The investment is high and the returns is very slow. If you plan to use her as a DPS, her burst up times also makes her very bad at multi-wave enemies. Her normal attack talent never has seen any use outside of meme builds, so using at level talent 1 is pretty much recommended. You don't need to worry too much about her artifact substat since she is built on a triple HP. Just try to get some crit rate so that you can proc Favonius consistently if you're using it. You can play her at the level 80 since her buff is fairly irrelevant regardless. But if you feel like you need more healing, then you should take her to level 90 first and foremost. Now, this may be a bit of an unpopular question since many of us have already know the answer, but I've seen some of you asking whether or not Sigewinne is future-proof and will we see any possible use of her in the future, and of course the answer is most likely going to be a no. Nothing that Sigewinne provides, especially without Constellation, are incredibly unique and game-changing. Her buffs, elemental applications, and damage are all fairly inconsequential, and most elemental skill-based DPS unit can't even use them due to the off-field restriction. Even Furina, who is able to use her effectively, does not actually benefit much from her buff because it is so minuscule. Even her role as a hydro healer is already hotly contested by several other characters. She is the best of the bunch when it comes to healing alone, but she can't compete at all when it comes to her overall versatility. With only 4 team slots per team, unfortunately she just doesn't stand out enough to justify a place over strong buffers, healers, and other hydro applicators. For the current meta though, the release of Natlin character did Sigewinne pretty much no favors, moving away from Bond of Life mechanics, and tonight so makes it very likely for her Bond of Life to remain just as irrelevant gimmick. If you are trying to pull to help your account clear the abyss easier or just pulling for powers, Sigewinne is not advisable to pull since she doesn't accomplish much in the current meta and likely will not in the foreseeable future. However, there are people out there who like Sigewinne and are considering her constellation, which is where we're going to be looking into that. The Sigewinne constellation path is a bit interesting since the early constellation leans into improving her buffing capability. Meanwhile, her later constellation only increases her personal damage. Though her personal damage goes more than triples from C0 to C6, it should be noted that her baseline is quite low, so the actual damage dealt isn't comparable to the stronger C6 in the game. For C1, this constellation in short makes her E hit more times, which means that it will heal more, increase the buff from her Ascension passive, and increase the number of times that buff can be triggered. The buff becomes a bit more relevant, but the overall team DPS increase of this cons is just not that noticeable, hovering around 5 to 10% increase. Her C2 is her best support constellations and the largest buff in her kit for the team. It provides a 35% hydro resistance shred to any enemies hit by her E skill or her burst. It also provides a shield which seems really nice at a cursory glance, but only protects Sigewinne during her E skill and elemental burst animations and disappeared immediately afterward. Just to reiterate, the shield is completely worthless, especially considering her burst already give her full resistance to interruptions. This constellation does open you up to a non-Furina team comps at very least, but there's only 2 hydro characters who can benefit from it due to the restrictions, namely Neuvillette and Mualani. This constellation has seen some use prior, but with the release of Shilonin and Sitlali, she becomes a fair less reliant option, especially considering that her resistance shred requires her E skill or burst to hit the enemies, and it can have the propensity to miss in multi-targets. This would be my recommended stopping point for vertical invested on Sigewinne unless you can plan to go all the way to C6. The C4, this constellation is practically irrelevant until C6 since her ultimate damage is still too low to justify on fielding her over another character on your team in the vast majority of the situations. And then for C6, this constellation is pretty straightforward. Sigewinne's burst gains a 20% crit rate and 110 crit damage. So basically a 150% crit value. Her C6 retroactively makes her C4 for a strong Constellation by effectively doubling her damage output. This is the point where she can't consistently be worth on-fielding, though she is still competing with C0 on-fielder such as Newblade rather than exceeding them. Her main benefit is that her damage is front-loaded since she has a 5.5 second damage window, though this can also be detriment when it comes to Abyss content where more flexible rotation are valuable. To put it simply, she's a good on-fielder at C6, but there are plenty of other on-fielder who are comparable or outclassing her while being at a C0 level. She is one of the weakest C6 on-fielder in the game, similar to power of a C6 Ayato, so I wouldn't really recommend it if you're pulling for purely power, but if you are a Sigewinne main, this will be a dramatic power spike. Since we have discussed a bit about her C6 and Constellation investment, here's a bit of a world team discussion where C6 Sigewinne world teams are somewhat complicated and generally falls into two main types, being either Mavuika carry teams or Furina base team. So for Mavuika carry teams, this functions similar to a Newblade best C6 team utilizing Mavuika at C6 as an off-field damage dealer and pyro applicator, while C6 is the on-field damage dealer. Since Sigewinne's hydro application is fairly low, Mavuika's skill can enable her to vaporize her burst, though it's still not very consistent. For Furina base teams, the setup revolves around Sigewinne and Furina as a sub DPS. A typical team would include a C6 Sigewinne, a C6 Yelan, C6 Furina, and a Shilonen. However, this team comes with its own set of issues, as each unit wants to have a bit of an on-field time. The standard approach is to do 2 to 3 of Furina C6 auto attack, followed by Sigewinne's elemental burst and then a C6 Yelan, allowing Yelan to stack her passive damage in the background. However, the exact rotation will depend on energy requirements and enemy matchups. Other than that, we have Mono Hydro at C6 as well, where despite seeming like a natural choice, Mono Hydro team at C6 do not perform as well as Vaporize teams featuring C6 Yelan or C6 Furina, both of which significantly outperform pure Hydro setup in terms of damage output. So you can play if you really want to, but it is something that you want to take note of. Now, teams with other new Natlin characters that have comes, considering that there are no character that can be very much comparable with Sigewinne at the current point, I don't think and would not expect any future character to do so either. So we've already discussed quite a lot of information about Sigewinne throughout this video. My final thought on her honestly would be that she is very much a cute character. Her animations are great, her calipat designs, I really like everything about her in terms of design, apart from her kit. Oh my god, if you're looking into a meta perspective, obviously Oyoverse did not do her any favors. So Sigewinne is pretty much a niche pick at best. If you love her, go for it, but from the meta perspective, she's just not looking great. If you have a Furina and just want to have a comfy healer for Nila Bloom team, or maybe a Klee if you're still a Klee main, then she is going to be a decent solid pick. Otherwise, yeah, she's pretty much not ever going to be a good pick in terms of meta perspective. So guys, I hope that the video have been very helpful in terms of Sigewinne discussion for you guys. If you have any questions, leave it down in the comment sections and I or some other lovely Genshin player will get to you there. If you're new to the channel guys, don't forget to subscribe. Me and the team put a lot of effort into making this guide to help you guys out. With that, I hope you a super day and I'll catch you on my next video.